Continuing the reading of the book Transactionalism, Chapter 4. The Aim Studies. Dewey's early psychological writings find contemporary expression in the work of a group of researchers known as transactional psychologists, whose chief contention it is that all aspects of experience are interdependent. Of their research, Dewey himself wrote, "I think it is by far the most important work done in the psychological, philosophical field during this century. I am tempted to say the only really important work." Some of the basic assumptions of this work will now be examined. Perception. The aim studies of perception loom large in the annals of transactional psychology. For the earlier Gestalt psychologists, perception was seen to be the experience which is the end product of retinal stimulation together with cortical organization. For transactionalists, however, the phenomenon is something very different. It is an experiencing that is a personal and strictly private event, a form of response to the environment in the shape of an interpretation of it. This is so because, for the transactionalists, stated concisely, perceiving is that part of the process of living by which each one of us form his own particular point of view, creates for himself the world within which he has his life's experiences, and through which he strives to gain his satisfactions. The process by which a particular person attributes significances to his immediate environmental situation. In precisely the same way that John Dewey and Arthur Bentley explained the transactional process through various analogies designed to demonstrate the interdependence of all aspects of experience, transactional psychologists have explained the perceptual process in terms of transaction. The buyer-seller illustration employed by Dewey and Bentley, which showed conclusively that the functional character of a buyer as buyer is impossible of definition when held apart from his transaction with a seller, is carried over into the psychological realm, where individuals are regarded as being involved with all other aspects of the perceptual process rather than as static abstractions. The work of the transactional psychologists strongly suggested that the various aspects of which the perceiving process is composed cannot exist independently in their own right. That is to say, they may only be viewed transactionally in a system embracing both perceiver and perceived. A greatly simplified version of one of Ames' demonstrations illustrates this point. Two vertical lines of unequal length are drawn side by side, the longer slightly below the shorter. Upon being questioned, a subject will invariably state he sees two lines, one placed below or above the other. He may volunteer the information that the lines are of unequal lengths. When, however, it is suggested to him that the lines are actually the vertical components of football goalposts, the subject sees the lines in terms of distance from him. By employing suitable phraseology, the posts are able to be viewed once again as lines, and the experiment may be repeated an indefinite number of times. Although the word see was used in the preceding paragraph, perceive would have been more accurate. For perceiving is more than seeing. It is the organizing of what is seen, felt, and sensed into a meaningful arrangement related to the already organized system which is the individual. Visual perception involves an impression not only of where an object is, but of what it is. In an observer's consciousness, the thatness is not separated from the there-ness. By thatness is meant the object perceived. By there-ness, its distance and direction, its location with respect to the observer. In the example, the thatness, which was the straight line or pole, was inseparable from its juxtaposition relative to a second line or pole. In fact, whether the objects are perceived as lying above or below one another, or nearer or further away from an observer, depends on what it is they are perceived to be. Upon, to recur to the foregoing quotation, the already organized system which is the individual. The actual significance the environment has for a particular person can originate only with some personal experience. The meaning we relate to any sense impression is derived only through our past experiences as we have tried to carry out our purposes. The whole psychology of learning and conditioning might usefully be oriented to study the learning process as an instrument man uses in acquiring his sense of what is significant for his purposeful behavior. By relating to one another, often unconsciously, the many experiences he has undergone, the individual is able to construct an idea of the probable significance of a particular occurrence or object in his environment. Thus, in the example of the two poles, the observer brought with him the belief built up from past experience that, given equality of size, when one object appears smaller than another, the former is at a greater distance from the observer than the latter. This happens because man appears to have the capacity to integrate several former experiences into what the transactional psychologists have termed a weighted average, and he subsequently acts as if the present were identical to the past. That is, he acts on hunches. In Ames' words, thatness and there-ness are qualities abstracted from a thatness-there-ness specificity, the latter being a statistical weighted average of similar specificities, with which a person has had earlier experience. Whether or not an observer finds significance in a particular thatness quality will depend upon his specific interests, which is to say, upon his purposes and expectations. In a similar manner, there-ness significance will vary according to the specific position of the thatness relative to the observer. For these reasons, Ames referred to specificities as complete. It would seem of necessity to follow conclusively that if in a concrete situation where the experiencer is related to otherness, if he is conscious at all, what is in consciousness is complete specificity, including specific thatness and there-ness, purposes and expectancies in the specific now of the experiencer both in space and in time. Transactionalists further accord to perception the characteristic of meaningful awareness, asserting it, perception, to be a process through which significances are attributed to oneself, one's immediate environmental situation, and to the relationship between them. Thus, perception includes not only a thatness and a there-ness, but also an I-ness, another abstracted quality of specificity, which reflects the internal organismic processes participating in the entire transaction. Early in his writings, Ames declared that man's awarenesses are only prognostic presumptions, prognostic directives for actions. It is never possible, Ames declared, to know directly external events. At the very most, what is received through the senses and through ideas must be considered a prognosis of the significance of those events. Through such assertions, Ames demonstrated his indebtedness and allegiance to the tradition of Peirce, James, and Dewey, for, in effect, he was insisting that knowledge of things in themselves is impossible, and that the search for such knowledge must be surrendered as an impossible epistemological goal. For it would seem that nothing that can be pointed at exists as a reality in its own right, but only in transactional relationship to everything else that can be pointed at. We have believed that our knowledge discloses the innate constitution of things apart from their relationship to us. We fail to realize that we can know nothing about things beyond their significance to us. It is only when we recognize that so-called facts and truths in themselves are not the ultimate goal, but have value insofar as they show us the ever-becoming reality and contribute to our purposes, that we shall cease to be hoaxed. Transaction in these terms may thus be considered, as it was in a preceding chapter, as a process of becoming, or rather as a word designating this process, where becoming is an aspect of nature made apparent to man as he attempts to overcome frustration while carrying out his particular purposes. It is significant that Ames has defined life itself, within which all transactions occur, as a process in which an organism participates in the creation of an environment through which it can carry out its purposes. A man acts on the basis of his prognostic directives, the only source of his knowledge, of the probabilities provided by his unique way of perceiving the significances of external events. He creates his own environment, and through this act of creation asserts his very existence. But the process of creating is contingent upon the placing of bets and the acting on hunches referred to earlier. Man seeks to know his world by playing the role of bet-abilitarian. And the test of the validity of his perception is its predictive value as a guide for action. It is now possible to formulate a more comprehensive definition of perception. Cantrill has offered the following. A perception may be defined as an implicit awareness of the probable consequences an action might have for us with respect to carrying out some purpose that has value for us. From this definition, it follows that what we have in mind or what we perceive now is almost invariably related to our expectancies for the future. Whether this future is the probable consequences of our actions within the next fraction of a second, or the probable consequences of our actions of the now, or the probable consequences our actions of the now may have for us 20 years hence. Perception itself is the part and parcel of purposive activity. It is an emergent co-product of purposive activity and cannot really be understood except in that context.